Out on the edge of South Australia's mid-north, there is a stretch of land that does not care who you are, how old you are, or how careful you think you've been. It's the kind of country that looks manageable from a distance and turns hostile the moment you step into it. Scrub stretches to the horizon, landmarks blur together, and silence carries farther than sound ever could. This is where police keep returning again and again, searching for answers that still refuse to surface. This is where 4-year-old August Gus Lamont vanished. When the first reports came through that a young child was missing from a remote sheep station, it triggered a familiar response across Australia. We've seen this before. A child wanders. A search begins. The outcome is usually painful, but at least it's known. What makes this case different, and what continues to unsettle investigators and the public alike, is that Gus didn't just get lost. He seemed to evaporate. From the start, police understood the stakes. This was not suburban bushland or a national park with clear walking tracks. This was a working station, 40+ kilometers from the nearest town, with terrain that shifts from deceptively open to dangerously complex within minutes. The margins for error here are razor thin, especially for a child. Gus had been staying with his grandparents. He wasn't unfamiliar with the property or the lifestyle. Like many country kids, he was comfortable outdoors, used to space and freedom, and known to explore within what adults assume are safe boundaries. On that Saturday afternoon, nothing about his behavior raised alarm. He was playing near the homestead, visible, occupied and calm. His grandmother last saw him around 5 o'clock. Half an hour later, when she went looking for him again, he was gone. No shouting, no sound of distress, no obvious trail leading away from the house. Just a sudden, jarring absence where a child had been moments earlier. Think about that for a moment. 30 minutes is not a long time. It's barely enough time to make a cup of tea, let alone for a 4-year-old to disappear into a landscape that would challenge experienced adults. And yet, in that window, something happened that changed everything. Police were notified quickly, and what followed was an immediate escalation. This wasn't treated as a routine missing child call. Officers on the ground recognized that the environment alone made this a critical situation. Within hours, the response grew into what would become the largest missing person search operation in South Australian history. Resources poured in. Ground crews spread out across the station. Search dogs worked scent lines that faded almost as quickly as they were found. Horses were brought in to navigate terrain vehicles couldn't handle. Drones scanned from above. Helicopters crisscrossed the sky. The State Emergency Service joined the effort, followed by the Australian Defence Force. An Indigenous tracker was brought in, someone trained to read subtle disturbances in land most of us would never notice. The scale of the operation was staggering. Around 60 square kilometers of land were methodically searched. Every gully was walked, every rise was climbed, every dam was checked. Searchers pushed themselves physically, some covering tens of thousands of steps a day under punishing conditions. Volunteers arrived from surrounding towns, dropping their own lives without hesitation. In places like this, when a child goes missing, people don't ask why. They just show up. Throughout those early days, Gus's family stayed out of the spotlight. There were no emotional pleas to camera, no interviews filled with speculation. Instead, a close family friend spoke on their behalf, delivering a statement that captured shock, disbelief, and devastation. They described a family struggling to comprehend how their little boy could simply vanish. Behind closed doors, they were clinging to hope, even as each hour made survival less likely. And that reality became impossible to ignore. This land is unforgiving. Nights grow cold quickly. Days bring heat and dehydration. Water sources are sparse. Shelter is minimal. For a 4-year-old without food, water, or protection, survival time is brutally short. Police were honest about that, at least behind the scenes. They began preparing the family for the possibility that Gus might not be found alive. It was a conversation no parent ever expects to have, and one no investigator wants to deliver. But the clock does not stop for hope. Despite that, search teams refuse to slow down. Every additional hour felt like one more chance to find something, anything that could lead them to Gus. Then, 4 days into the search, something finally emerged from the dust. A small boot print. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't definitive, but it was the first physical sign that Gus had been there, that he had walked across that ground. For searchers who had been combing the property without success, that single mark changed the mood instantly. Teams regrouped, search patterns tightened. The discovery injected new energy into an operation that was already pushing human limits. For a brief moment, hope surged again. But hope needs evidence to survive, and this is where the case took a darker turn. No further footprints were found, no trail continued from that point. There were no dropped items of clothing, no hat, no toy, nothing that suggested panic or struggle. The land seemed to absorb the evidence just as completely as it had absorbed the child. After a week of relentless searching, police made the call that no one wanted to hear. The active search was suspended. There would be no miracle rescue. Gus had not been located. For the public, that moment felt like an ending, but in reality, it marked a transition. When a search ends without answers, an investigation begins in earnest. Within hours of search crews leaving the property, crime scene investigators returned. The homestead became the focus. Photographs were taken from every angle. Measurements were recorded. Movements were reconstructed. Gus's grandmother was spoken to again. The precise locations where he had last been seen were examined in detail. To experienced observers, the level of scrutiny stood out. This was not procedural box-ticking. Investigators were clearly unsettled by what they weren't finding. Former detectives watching the case noted something deeply concerning. In most missing child cases, there is a narrative. Even when the outcome is tragic, there is usually a sequence of events that explains how it happened. Here, that narrative was missing. Gary Jublin, a former homicide detective who worked on some of Australia's most confronting cases, summed it up bluntly. Children do not vanish without explanation. In the overwhelming majority of cases, they are found. When they aren't, it suggests something has gone very wrong. For many Australians, that observation reopened old wounds. The disappearance of William Tyrrell came back into focus, a 3-year-old boy who vanished from his grandmother's home in New South Wales, never to be found. His case became a national scar, a reminder that sometimes answers don't come, no matter how hard authorities look. Police were keenly aware of that comparison. They stressed that lessons from past cases had shaped their approach. From the earliest stages of Gus's disappearance, they said they were running parallel lines of inquiry. They were searching for a lost child, but they were also investigating the possibility that something else had occurred. Known offenders in the region were canvassed. The feasibility of an abduction was examined. Road access was analyzed, but the facts didn't support that theory. The road leading to the property was not a public thoroughfare. It was used almost exclusively by station owners and service vehicles. There were no reports of suspicious vehicles. No witnesses came forward with credible sightings. With no evidence of foul play, police maintained publicly that their leading theory remained that Gus had wandered somewhere onto the property and had not been located. And this is where the case begins to fracture public confidence. Because as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the absence of answers became harder to reconcile with the scale of the effort that had been deployed. 60 square kilometers searched multiple times. Air and ground assets used extensively, specialist trackers involved, and yet almost nothing to show for it. That vacuum invited speculation. Online, the case began to take on a life of its own. Amateur sleuths dissected timelines. Some people proposed theories, others made accusations. A handful claimed psychic insight. While many genuinely wanted to help, the noise quickly overwhelmed the signal. Police warned repeatedly that misinformation was not just unhelpful, but harmful. It distracted investigators and inflicted further pain on the family. Friends and neighbors of the Lamonts eventually felt compelled to speak out. They described the family as decent people, deeply rooted in the community. Rural Australians in particular pushed back against conspiracy theories, pointing out how easily such a tragedy could occur in country settings. More than once, locals said the same thing. This could have been any of our kids. Behind the scenes, police continued their work. 34 days after Gus disappeared, search teams returned to the property. This time, they focused on areas that had already been searched. A dam was drained, emptying millions of liters of water. Divers crawled through thick sludge and weeds, rechecking every corner. When they finished, investigators ruled out drowning at that location. Once again, the result was nothing. Frustration mounted, and tensions occasionally spilled into public view. One incident made headlines when footage emerged of Gus's grandmother holding a shotgun on the homestead porch and ordering a reporter to leave. The images were confronting, but police later clarified the context. The firearm was being used legitimately to deal with a snake near the house. There was no threat intended. Still, the moment added another layer of confusion to an already bewildering case. Months later, police returned again. New information had pointed them toward abandoned mine shafts near the property's boundary. These shafts are common in parts of South Australia, remnants of old mining operations, often hidden and extremely dangerous. Specialist teams examined 6 separate shafts. Each was searched thoroughly. Each was cleared. Gus was not there. By this point, any realistic hope of finding him alive had faded, but investigators made one thing clear. They were not walking away. Cases like this do not close neatly. They linger. They sit in the back of investigators' minds, resurfacing whenever new information appears. For those involved, this case became something heavier than an unsolved file. It became a reminder of how fragile assumptions can be, of how a moment of normality can fracture into lifelong uncertainty, of how the bush, so familiar and trusted by those who live within it, can still turn deadly without warning. Years from now, it is possible that chance will deliver what exhaustive searches could not. Heavy rain might expose something buried. Erosion might reveal a clue. Someone, somewhere, might finally say something they've held on to. Many long unsolved cases end this way, not through brilliance, but through time. Until then, Gus Lamont remains a name tied to an unanswered question. A 4-year-old boy who vanished on land his family knew well, under circumstances that refused to make sense. His disappearance sits alongside other unresolved cases, not because it is sensational, but because it is profoundly unsettling. A child playing in the afternoon, a brief gap in attention, 30 minutes that changed everything. If you've followed this case, if you've ever tried to imagine what really happened out there, ask yourself this. With the resources that were deployed, with the ground that was covered, with the years that have passed, how is it possible that nothing has emerged? That question is why this case refuses to disappear. And if you think stories like this matter, if you believe unresolved cases deserve more than silence, make sure you're subscribed to Behind the Crime Scene. Because some mysteries don't end when the search stops. They wait. And that waiting is what unsettles people the most. Not the certainty of a tragic ending, but the absence of one. Humans are wired to seek conclusions, even painful ones, because an ending at least gives shape to grief. What this case offers instead is an open wound, one that never quite closes because there is no moment you can point to and say, "This is where it ended." Investigators have said privately that cases like this become benchmarks, not in the sense of success or failure, but in how they reshape thinking. Every missing child investigation that follows carries echoes of Gus Lamont. Officers ask themselves different questions now. They revisit assumptions more aggressively. They hesitate before accepting the simplest explanation, because sometimes the simplest explanation leaves too much unanswered. One of the most troubling questions has never really gone away. If Gus wandered off, where did he go? Children his age do not travel efficiently. They stop. They turn back. They cry, they leave signs. Even in difficult terrain, there is usually some form of breadcrumb trail, something that suggests direction or intention. Here there was almost none. One possible boot print, and then silence. For many seasoned searchers, that defies experience. Another question lingers just as heavily. If the land itself claimed him, why has it not given anything back? The bush has a way of revealing truths over time. Bones surface, clothing appears after rain or fire, wildlife scatters remains, but not always completely. Yet despite repeated searches and changing seasons, nothing has surfaced that can be definitively linked to Gus. That absence forces investigators to hold multiple possibilities in their minds at once, even when none of them feel satisfying. They must consider the environment, the timing, the geography, and human behavior, all without the anchor of physical evidence. It is a balancing act between logic and humility, between what seems likely and what can actually be proven. For the family, that balancing act is even more brutal. Life does not pause just because answers are missing. Days turn into years. Birthdays come and go. Milestones pass quietly. Friends want to help, but do not know how. There is no script for living with uncertainty of this magnitude. Grief without confirmation is a unique kind of weight, one that never fully settles. People close to the family have described how even well-meaning conversations can reopen wounds. Every new theory, every online discussion, every anniversary brings the case back into sharp focus. At the same time, silence can feel just as cruel, as though the world is moving on while their questions remain frozen in time. Within police ranks, the case remains active in a technical sense, even if there are no daily updates. Tips are still logged, files are reviewed, new technologies are quietly considered. Advances in forensic science have solved cases decades old, and investigators are acutely aware that today's dead end could become tomorrow's breakthrough. There is also an understanding that rural cases pose unique challenges. Distances are vast, evidence degrades quickly, weather is relentless, human memory fades, witnesses move away. All of this compounds over time, making the task harder with each passing year. And yet history shows that time can also work in the opposite direction, loosening tongues and shifting circumstances. What keeps this case alive in the public imagination is not just the mystery, but how ordinary its beginning was. There was no dramatic event, no warning sign that something terrible was about to happen. It started as an afternoon, like countless others. That ordinariness makes it relatable, and that relatability makes it frightening. Parents across Australia have quietly replayed the scenario in their own minds. A moment of distraction, a task that needed attention, a child who seemed safe. The line between normal life and irreversible tragedy can be frighteningly thin, especially in environments where help is far away. Over time, the land around Oak Park Station has continued its cycle. Seasons have changed, stock has moved through paddocks, wind and rain have reshaped the surface. To an outsider, it looks unchanged, timeless even. But for those who know what happened there, it carries a different weight. Every patch of ground becomes a question, every hollow a possibility. Police have been careful with their language whenever the case resurfaces. They avoid absolutes. They avoid promises. They speak instead of commitment, of continued interest, of openness to new information. It is the only honest position when certainty is out of reach. And yet the public still asks, quietly or loudly, whether everything that could be done was done, whether there was a moment early on when something critical was missed, whether a different assumption, a different search pattern, or a different interpretation might have led to a different outcome. These are not accusations, so much as human attempts to impose order on chaos. Former investigators have acknowledged that hindsight is a powerful but dangerous tool. It can illuminate blind spots, but it can also distort reality. Decisions made under pressure, with limited information and brutal time constraints, rarely look perfect when examined years later. What matters is whether those decisions were reasonable at the time, given what was known. Still, questions remain. They always do in cases like this. Why was there so little trace? Why did the scent not lead anywhere definitive? Why did repeated searches fail to turn up even a fragment of evidence? Each unanswered question adds another layer to the mystery, another reason the case refuses to fade. As time passes, the risk is not just that evidence disappears, but that attention does. Cases slip from public view. Priorities shift. New tragedies emerge, but some stories resist that process, resurfacing again and again because they touch something deeper than news cycles. Gus Lamont's disappearance is one of those stories. It is not loud. It is not sensational. It is quiet, unsettling, and unresolved. And that is precisely why it endures. If one day the land yields an answer, it will bring a different kind of pain, but also a measure of truth. Until then, the case exists in that uncomfortable space between hope and acceptance, where nothing can be confirmed and nothing can be ruled out completely. So the question remains, and it is one worth asking carefully. In a country as vast and as familiar with the bush as Australia, how does a child vanish so completely? Is it a reminder of nature's power, or a sign that there is still something we do not understand about what happened that day? That question is not just for investigators. It is for all of us. And as long as it remains unanswered, the story of Gus Lamont will continue to be told, not as a finished chapter, but as an open one, waiting for whatever comes next.